Further. So now we're going to move on to our panel on basic science partnerships, and it's my pleasure and honor to introduce these individuals. We'll be having Dr. Lisa Newman, who is the Chief of Division of Breast Surgery and the Director of Interdisciplinary Breast Disease Program, as well as the Medical Director of the International Center for the Study of Breast Cancer Subtypes. She will be speaking with us today, as well as Dr. Laura from Indiana University, who we heard from earlier, and Dr. Davis, who's joining us through teleconference. So I'll first have Dr. Newman come up to give her remarks. Thank you.
Don't go too far away because I'm not going to be able to find the presentation. Sorry about that. So while Anya finds my slides.
There you go.
There we go.
And then to advance here, this way.
Oh, great. Thanks. No problem. So it's a tremendous, tremendous pleasure and honor to join you guys today, and so heartening to see this beautiful young generation of investigators and researchers involved with global health and global work, especially when it comes to cancer. It's also very humbling to be amongst you young people, because I came into international research and international efforts because of the research interests, and it really seems as though the younger generation, you guys have done it for all the right reasons in terms of just the pure humanity and altruism of it all. So I thank you and I congratulate you for your efforts. I became involved with international efforts, specifically involving Africa, out of my desire to learn more about some of the factors in terms of genetics that were driving breast cancer disparities between African American and white American women. And back when I trained in the 1990s, these disparities in terms of health outcomes, and especially with breast cancer, were largely attributed to socioeconomic disparities. And as demonstrated on these simple, very basic bar graphs, the most common socioeconomic disadvantages, living below poverty level, being unemployed, are about twice as high in the African American community compared to white Americans. And so it's pretty easy to surmise that these types of disadvantages lead to delays in screening and making a diagnosis of breast cancer, treating a breast cancer comprehensively. Ultimately, this results in a more advanced stage distribution, and most tragically, the higher mortality rates. But we've actually known for many years now that something else aside from socioeconomic status was contributing to disparities in the world of breast cancer outcomes. And some of the evidence of this something else is depicted by this meta-analysis that I and several colleagues from the Harvard School of Public Health published several years ago, where we simply pulled together all of the data in the published literature looking at survival from breast cancer in Black women compared to white women after accounting for some measure of socioeconomic status. And as you can see, the Black breast cancer patients in this adjusted meta-analysis continued to have a statistically significant, nearly 30% higher mortality rate. Furthermore, if you look at the other characteristics that describe the breast cancer burden of African American women, we see several factors that can't be ascribed to socioeconomic status, such as the younger age distribution of breast cancer in Black breast cancer patients, the facts that we are more likely to be diagnosed with adverse tumor features in our breast cancers, such as the more higher grade lesions, the estrogen receptor negative, the triple negative breast cancers being the tumors that are negative for the estrogen receptor, the progesterone receptor, and the HER2 new marker, and these are indeed biologically more aggressive lesions. There are also very poorly understood reasons for a higher population-based incidence rate of inflammatory breast cancer, another biologically aggressive form of the disease in African American women. And there's a higher incidence of male breast cancer in the African American community. All of these factors can't really ascribe to socioeconomic status, so we do need to look at factors related to the genetics and tumor biology. So this is what led me and my research colleagues to look at the breast cancer burden on the continent of Africa, because we wanted to see whether there were some hereditary features related to African ancestry in and of itself that were predisposing African American women to these biologically aggressive patterns of the disease. And we also thought that this would be a very powerful and unique opportunity to learn about the etiology of triple-negative breast cancer, a disease that continues to elude us in terms of the advances in treatment and advances in understanding the root causes of this phenotype. So when I worked at the University of Michigan from 2002 until 2015, I had the pleasure of being able to get involved with the establishment of an international breast cancer registry, which involved our colleagues in Africa, specifically in Ghana initially. And our initial goal was to understand the burden of disease in that country with the hope of understanding how African ancestry was associated with a inherited susceptibility for high-risk breast cancer. So the initial challenge, of course, in getting this international registry started was in being able to establish durable partnerships, because our colleagues who deliver healthcare in Africa have so many, as you've been hearing today, so many competing needs in terms of being pulled in different directions to take care of the very, very difficult and broad-spread health threats that face the populations there. So it's hard for them to partner with American investigators when it comes to specific research efforts. But somehow they make it work. I have such tremendous, tremendous respect for our colleagues in Africa. Absolutely amazing physicians and amazing researchers. I just don't know how they find the time and the energy to get so much accomplished. Now, some of the messages that have remained steadfast over the many years that I've been involved in this work is that these international partnerships absolutely are worthwhile. They are certainly transformative on a personal level. And I've also learned very definitively that investment in the research is actually an investment in clinical care, and it does allow us to capacity build. And over the next several photographs, I'll show you some examples of that. So for anybody who's interested in starting a research partnership internationally, de novo, I encourage you to build upon the successes of others that have already been involved with this type of work. When I was at the University of Michigan, I had the pleasure and the honor of working with this phenomenal OBGYN doctor, Timothy Johnson, who is chairman of the Department of OBGYN at the University of Michigan for several decades, a long, long time. Tim Johnson is absolutely amazing. He established an exchange program in maternal and fetal health between the University of Michigan, Ghana, and ultimately Ethiopia and other countries. And through getting to know Tim, I was able to build upon his successes and partner with some physicians in Ghana and surgeons in Ghana who were interested in looking at some of the breast cancer research questions that we were involved with. And this is just a few photos of the Comfanochi Teaching Hospital in Ghana. This is a photo of one of our very first trips many, many years ago with a relatively small research team, traveled with a couple of research assistants at that time. And Dr. Bafor Awa, who's all the way to the right of this slide, continues to be the site PI for our research program at Comfanochi. The young lady who's standing right in the middle next to me is Dr. Iman Martin, a fabulous, fabulous epidemiologist. She has now since launched her own independent career in global health, and just an amazing young lady. So we, over the past many years, have been very heavily involved with the surgical program at Comfanochi, and that's what I've been doing all my life. That's what I know. So that was the most convenient area for me to get involved with at Comfanochi. And it was also a perfectly aligned with the breast cancer questions that we wanted to answer, because the surgery obviously gives us access to tissue very readily. And these are just a couple of photos of us in the operating room, our research assistants getting consent from the patients that we work with. At the bottom to the right is a fabulous young lady who's one of the tribal queen mothers who actually we operated on for an inflammatory breast cancer several years ago, and she's continued to do quite well. This work is expensive. The hospitals where we work and where you guys work, as you know, they have very few resources. And when you travel over to these other countries, we certainly can't strip the local environment of their resources to do what we need to do from a research perspective. So you really do have an obligation to bring all the supplies that you need with you, and you have a moral obligation to leave as many resources there as possible to enhance the care that's being delivered after you leave. And so we've been very gratified by the work that we've been able to do and the capacity building that we've been able to invest in. We were able to develop a core needle biopsy training program, which enhanced the efficiency of breast cancer diagnoses being made. And we continue to provide the core biopsy needle supplies regularly because they are quite expensive. A big problem in terms of breast cancer management in Africa is the paucity of immunohistochemistry pathology programs, crippling the physicians in terms of knowing the phenotype of the cancer, which is obviously quite important in determining the systemic therapy needs of the patients. So through the academic and training exchange, we have since been able to establish an immunohistochemistry program at Comfort Teaching Hospital in Kamasa, and since then have also established one in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. We were able to invest in the infrastructure for appropriate telemedicine and internet access, so that there is now a freestanding telemedicine unit where we communicate regularly for telemedicine tumor boards. And we are about to have the third of our annual Breast Cancer in Africa conferences. The first one was in Ghana, second one in Ethiopia, and the upcoming one in August will be held in Nigeria. And a highlight of every visit to Comfort is actually visiting the classroom for on the pediatrics ward, where we have just a lot of fun interacting with the kids and giving the kids school supplies and toys. So the program has grown over the past many years since we first started interacting with our partners in Ghana and then in Ethiopia. We have several other sites that are involved with the work that we do. And in 2015, when I and my colleagues moved over from the University of Michigan to run the breast program for the Henry Ford Health System, we developed a new name for our program. We put it under the umbrella of this name, the International Center for the Study of Breast Cancer Subtypes, which was initially headquartered at Henry Ford. Since relocating to Weill Cornell, we continue to partner with Henry Ford, and Henry Ford is a wonderful participating site in our program, but our program is now headquartered at Weill Cornell. We've had more than 30 publications based upon the work that we've done. 3 of our colleagues from Africa have gone on to get PhDs, one of whom has gotten her PhD at the University of Michigan and will be returning to Ghana to establish her own freestanding research program there. And over the years, several dozen students, trainees have participated in exchange visits in both directions. So it's been phenomenal in terms of growth for the program and also on a personal basis. The photo all the way at the top on the left is my son when he had his 11th birthday party. He's the fresh kid with the peace sign at the top there. And at the time, it was one of the visits when our research team from Ghana happened to be visiting us in Ghana. So we had the big birthday party for my son, and I used that as an example to show our colleagues how a whole bunch of very, very spoiled American kids live. Very, very spoiled, let me tell you. So my son continues to be spoiled. At the bottom of that photo from his birthday is Bobby, I guess, 6 years later, when he traveled with us to Ghana, he's actually become very, very involved with the whole research effort and research mission. And he's graduating this year from the University of Michigan, and his request for a graduation present was to return with me again to Ghana. So, Ani, May 27th, we're going back, right? You have to be with us during that one. The young lady at the top on the left is Dr. Evelyn Jage. She's the young lady that I mentioned previously, who started out as a surgeon trainee in Ghana at Comfort since as a result of being involved with our research collaboration, came to University of Michigan to get her PhD, and I had the pleasure of being godmother to her first baby, which is the little tyke shown at the bottom. Now she has 2 kids, and she's just in the process of getting ready to return to Ghana. So I've seen tremendous changes in Ghana and Kumasi itself over the years. This is a photograph of one of the very first ambulances that they had developed many years ago. And now the technology in Kumasi is way past anything that I'm even familiar or comfortable with. Last year, I took my first Uber ride in Kumasi. And there's a wonderful partnership in politics as well. Back in 2009, there was a newly elected president in Ghana, and we had a newly elected president here in the United States. Wonderful, wonderful synergies there. And right after President Obama visited Ghana, this little Hotel Obama opened up. And I just get a kick out of this slide, the cattle going across the street while we're in the cars. So an example of some of the heartbreak, but still progress with the work. We continue, unfortunately, to see tragically delayed breast cancer diagnoses, very advanced disease. But out of knowing about what's been going on at the hospitals where we work, we do see some women coming in with earlier stage disease. We now travel with a plastic surgeon, and we've even been able to do some breast reconstruction. And it's just a few slides of some of those results. Expansion of the registry, as I mentioned, now in Addis Ababa. We do still have a strong research focus, and I'm just going to talk about a little bit of that in my final minute. We were able to recruit this absolutely genius geneticist, Dr. Melissa Davis, who you're going to hear from as soon as I sit down. Melissa now serves as the scientific director for our international program, and she's been doing some absolutely amazing work in terms of figuring out the research questions that we initially defined for ourselves. Just some more photos of our more recent research team. The Ghana and the airport have actually totally embraced the concept of breast health awareness. So just to close, I want to mention briefly what we've been learning through the research. We see that these triple-negative breast cancers are the most common in Ghana, intermediate in frequency for African Americans between the rates that we see in Ghana and the rates that we see in white Americans. The frequencies of triple-negative breast cancers are actually the same in Ethiopia compared to what we see to white women and Europeans. And this is what we refer to as the field of oncologic anthropology, where we are trying to understand these patterns from the perspective of African ancestry. You saw something similar to this slide already with the transatlantic slave trade. Well, we think that this slave trade pattern also explains some of the patterns that we see with breast cancer. The transatlantic slave trade brought Western sub-Saharan Africans, including the ancestors of Ghana, across the ocean to serve as slaves in the colonies. And so as African Americans, we have a much more shared ancestry with contemporary Ghanaians than we do with contemporary East Africans, including Ethiopians, because the slave trade from East Africa largely went over to the Mideast and to Asia. And so we do not have a lot of shared ancestry there. And with several other markers, we see much more similar patterns between African Americans and West Sub-Saharan Africans. So Melissa has been trying to flesh this out, and she's been doing a lot of work with a genetic pattern related to what we call Duffy null, which is the Duffy blood group that everybody is familiar with. Well, Duffy null is a pattern that was adopted under very, very strong selective pressure several thousand years ago when the malaria pathogens first became endemic in Western Sub-Saharan Africa. And as a cause of this selective pressure in trying to survive malaria, pretty much everybody in Western Sub-Saharan Africa carries this particular variant called Duffy null. And as a consequence of genetic admixture, most but not all African Americans are Duffy null. Because of something called the Bantu expansion, where West Africans migrated across the continent, you see similar admixture in East Africa. And not all Ethiopians are Duffy null, because there was also a different malaria pattern in East Africa because of the mountainous highlands in many of those areas. So Melissa's been doing some amazing work looking at the downstream effect of this Duffy null variant on chemokine expression, and we think that the chemokine expression and the association with cancer risk actually may account for some of the differences that we see with breast cancer. So now with our new headquarters at Weill Cornell, we're excited about our expanded global work being aligned with the diverse population that we see in metropolitan New York, and we do a lot of work with the precision medicine team to further explore these areas. And so I bring everybody greetings from the Upper East Side, and thanks so much for your time.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Newman. Next, we will have Dr. Davis present on some of the research Dr. Newman just mentioned.
Okay, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, but I think we have to put up your slides. One moment.
Okay, I'm sharing them now.
Great.
Okay. So I'm sorry I can't actually see you, and unfortunately I also missed most of the talks. Although I saw them, I think I'll probably repeat some of what you've heard, but hopefully that just means you'll remember it all. Thank you, and greetings from New York City. Unfortunately, I couldn't be there with you today. I have no disclosures. So just as a brief outline, I wasn't actually going to talk much about the science today. I was going to talk about some of the obstacles that we have to overcome in order to do some of this research that we've discussed, that Dr. Newman just highlighted. I will close with a couple of emerging findings, because none of what we want to do could be done if we did not overcome these obstacles. And you'll notice on my first title slide, I had the word barriers, but I don't like to think of them as barriers. Barriers gives an impression of a wall, you know, things that you put up with the purpose of keeping something out or keeping something in. And I don't think that that's the impression I want to give. I know that we do have obstacles, but obstacles can be overcome. So I'm going to talk about three very broad, subcategories of what I consider the obstacles we've had to overcome. One is the built environment in the places where we go. Another is institutional infrastructure, and then lastly, cultural traditions. So when I think about the built environment, you know, there are some limitations that require modifications to the way we approach some of these scientific endeavors. So I'm going to show you a series of pictures along with just some dialogue. And this is just an image of one of the gates entering into the road going into the hospital area at one of our sites there in Africa. And so this is sort of very different, right, than what we are used to seeing, for instance, in the entrance of Weill Cornell with our beautiful circle drive and a line of shiny taxis. You know, just getting to some of these facilities can be very daunting. But when we get on the ground and we talk about actually doing some of these experiments, so for instance, one of the things that we do for our genomics work is collect fresh tissue directly from the operating theater. And typically when that happens at one of our westernized hospitals, we have an entire staff, right, standing by in a core lab that has state-of-the-art equipment, and that just does not typically exist at our African sites. So for instance, most of the equipment that we had access to is often out of date, or there's some flaw, or it doesn't even have the standard specifications required. So for instance, and I'll show you an image of this in my next slide, but the centrifuge, you know, one of the very standard pieces of equipment that's in any molecular biology lab, typically would have a display where you can set the speed, the timing, even the temperature on some of the fancier models, but that did not exist in Africa. Other things to deal with issues with facilities could be electrical compatibility. So some of the equipment just doesn't have the right voltage, or the plugs do not work, they aren't operational. Some places don't have good plumbing, so we don't even have running water or filtered water. And a lot of these protocols require very clean, enzymatic-free water. And so our solutions to these issues, for instance, for equipment, we just brought some pieces of equipment with us. For our facility at CAS, Kumasi, Ghana, Konfanochi Teaching Hospital, I'm actually purchasing pieces of equipment with some of our startup funds and having it installed within the Department of Pathology. And so having it installed on site means that that's sort of our investment, not only to do the work that we need to do, but I'll also train the pathologists and the student investigators there to be able to use these pieces of equipment even in our absence. And so in that way, we are building capacity. We had to modify some of the protocols. Typically, some of the steps to obtaining fresh tissue to grow 3D organoids, for instance, requires special instrumentation of homogenizing to dissociate the tumors into single-cell slurries. And we weren't able to do that because we could not bring a homogenizer. And so we modified the protocols and we used an enzymatic method. But you'll see in my final slide that we were successful. So some of these modifications, while they can be problematic and not even necessarily something we would attempt to do in a lab back in New York, modifying the protocols with careful thought and consideration of all of the limitations can overcome some of those limitations. And then for the facilities, the way we overcame some of this is to bring our own water source or bring our own filtration systems. And so we can use bottled water, for instance, bring bottles of enzymatically deactivated water, and also purchasing our own generators and adapters for the plugs. So these are just some examples. This is the centrifuge that I was talking about. It literally only turned on and off. And so I had to, by my many years of hearing centrifuge rotor spins, gauge how fast and how quickly I thought the tubes were spinning. And so I literally had to just flip the switch on and off to make sure that we didn't spin the tubes too quickly. We didn't necessarily have a state-of-the-art incubator. This was basically our lab setup here. So you can see it's not a sterile environment, but we took extra precautions, bringing our own sterilization wipes and ethanol, and we just made sure that we were very careful. And the piece of equipment that I'm actually having installed is a biosafety cabinet so that we will ensure sterile conditions for our next trip. This is Brittany. She's one of my graduate students, and so we packed very heavily on our trip to Ghana this last time. And the suitcase she's holding is actually all scientific equipment. We were actually questioned by one of the people in the lab as to why we were packing media in a suitcase. So, you know, it's not necessarily a traditional thing you would pack in a suitcase, but we certainly bring and leave behind a lot of the materials that we use. And so this, again, is just a close-up of our setup and how we actually had to carry out our protocols. So in terms of institutional infrastructure, again, typically in one of our institutions here, so at Henry Ford or Weill Cornell, we would have expertise in every aspect of everything that we do, people who have been thoroughly trained with years of experience. But oftentimes on the ground in Africa, we have to train people right on the spot in terms of how to handle things. And this is Dr. Newman just having a staff meeting right before one of her surgeries. And so we often find, especially as we sort of try to push the edge of cutting edge research, that because we are working in emerging fields, finding expertise in many of these institutions is going to be impossible. And so we become the expert team and the member on site, and we build experts, right? So whatever knowledge I have, I pass along. We were definitely approached many times by not only students, but other staff as we were there carrying out our protocols, wanting to learn, what are you doing? I want to learn how to do this. I want to be a part of this. And I welcome that. And I welcome that spirit. And I think that it's very important that as scientists, and as we think of building capacity and bringing resources to our collaborators, that we not only bring the materials, but we also bring the knowledge and the skills to do these things as well. Sometimes departments can have limitations in being understaffed or overutilized. So, for instance, we're currently starting to ramp up our collection of blood samples, and the phlebotomy clinics are very heavily used for infectious disease needs there in CAF, for instance. And so we invest in hiring new staff. We invest in bringing additional kits, for instance, for screening for HIV and tuberculosis and other infectious diseases that might be within some of the biospecimens that we collect, so that we don't at all utilize the resources that are there for the hospitals, but instead we enrich them with additional materials. And then again, like I said, we train specific collaborating staff. So Dr. Newman mentioned there that we, for instance, for histology and immunohistochemistry, teach workshops on how to do tissue preservation. We also actively train for clinical data retrieval from medical records and databasing. We set up remote access cloud databases and train investigators on how to use them. And so that sort of empowers them to do epidemiological research on their own patient cohorts. We also implement certain bioinformatics tools where we also give them tutorials on how to analyze genomics data. So that's our next step, is setting up a genomics lab right there in CAS to do some of the genomic sequencing that we readily do here at Weill Cornell. And again, this is in partnership with the Precision Medicine Institute here, who have been very strong allies of ours since we got here. And training leads to collaborations, and training can exist in the form of right there in the operating room, for instance, or we actually give grand rounds lectures where Dr. Newman goes over state-of-the-art surgical procedures. The surgical team for plastics comes and also gives a lecture. I gave a lecture on genomics and precision medicine. And excitedly, this time around, I think I'll actually have some data from our African sites to share with the collaborators there, so they become equal partners and reap the benefits of our scholarship as well. We have our symposium, our annual symposium, that we host in one of our African partner sites or cities. Last year, it was in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. This year, it will be in Nigeria. I'm not sure if we've decided yet on the city, but these are wonderful opportunities for collaboration, for workshops. So this year, we'll be hosting a clinical data analysis workshop in conjunction with the needle core biopsy workshops that we've held in the past. And so, again, that's just another set of skills that we are sort of planting the seed there. And because this is our annual symposium, it's not just for the single site where we are, but any membership from all over the continent, whoever comes to this symposium has free opportunity to join us in this training exercise as well. And then lastly, cultural norms and patient population traditions in education. So, one of the things that became very apparent to me when I first joined ICS-BCS is that even though I was sort of prepared to see that the African populations were, a generation behind us in terms of technology, they also have some very traditional cultural beliefs that can at sometimes be a barrier or an obstacle to treatment for some of the patients. So gender roles, for instance, or traditional medicine and disease management that is deeply embedded in their religious beliefs. I think it's very important that we are inclusive of all ethnicities and sects of religion, and that we understand, and so from a cultural competency standpoint, that we understand sort of their belief system and their limitations, and that we are respectful of those things, and that we use it as an opportunity of education and not just pushing them aside or saying, well, if you don't want our help, then, forget you, that which can sometimes, from a scientific standpoint, be the outcome whenever we have undereducated populations who are not necessarily resistant to science, but just have not been exposed to it in a language that they understand and in a way that they can appreciate. And so sometimes we find that the lack of understanding is because of language barriers. One young lady from one of our African partners told us that in many tribes there is no word for cancer, for instance. And so it's very difficult to tell someone what the diseases they have in order to treat them if there isn't even a word in their language that describes this ailment. And so because of this limited education, we also have community education partnerships, right? So, and we translate all of our documents into native languages. So when we do informed consent, which is, one of the tenets of doing human subjects research, is that the patient and the volunteers are fully informed of everything that we're doing. And even though from a research standpoint, some of what we're doing won't directly benefit them, it can lead to better outcomes in general for this population, and especially in Africa, because we know that there's a dearth of diversity in cancer research, in that the lack of genetic diversity has led to underrepresentation of our patients, but not only underrepresentation, but just simply a lack of tools, a lack of options that can address the type of disease, the type of the biology of the disease that African Americans and African women have. And so it's important that we make sure to educate women and their families and have a buy-in and an understanding about what it is we're here to do. And so some of that means, for instance, donating to an infectious disease unit reagents for their
Dr. Davis?
Yes.
Oh, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. Do you think you could take just one more minute and then, because we're running short on time?
Oh, sure. This is my last slide.
Thank you.
Okay. And sorry. Another thing is just sort of supporting the cultural environment. So this is Dr. Newman standing next to an artist in the Cultural Village, where she had a beautiful piece of artwork commissioned for our offices. And then lastly, all of this is so that we can bring our emerging wonderful technologies into the third world. And so this is just one of the pipelines from the Precision Medicine Institute, where we are setting up these 3D organoids. These are real organoids growing from Ghanaian patients that had surgeries back in October of last year. And we're setting these up to create drug screens and genetic screens to identify novel targets to improve treatment options for women who have these types of tumors. And that's it. These are just my acknowledgments from the team through ICS BCS, and I'm happy to take any questions anyone has.
Thank you so much. So we'll leave the questions for the end of the session, and at this time I'll invite Dr. Lur up to give his remarks.
So my job is always to be the last person before there's a break or food. So it's a great pleasure here. So to be honest, I'm supposed to be Fumi Olapati, and anybody who knows Fumi, you know that there's absolutely nothing about us. I'm short, she's taller, and otherwise we're separated at birth. So I guess, do I push this? Okay. So Fumi, so long and short is that I'm not a basic oncologist. I'm a clinical oncologist. Tomorrow there's going to be a session that's going to be entitled Perspective of Senior Mentors, Chairs, and Directors, which would have been a perfect place for me to talk. And so what I decided to do was basically take, because I'm the last one here, take the perspective of being able to talk about whatever I want to talk about here. I wanted to take on a question or two that was brought in earlier. Originally, when I got an email, basically this was kind of the concept of talking about clinical research, basic research, and the capacity building for education and training. And one of the aspects that I think is an important question for all of you and all of us here in North America is, how do you establish a career in global health when your division director or a cancer center director really wants you to deal about things that are important here in this country? And I think it's critically important. When you go to the NCI looking for funding, I just got through 2 days ago with our NCI site visit, which is one of the reasons why, I feel so relieved right now. In the RFA for Cancer Center, the word global health, how many people, if you look for global health and do a word search in this how many times do you think you see that in the RFA? Take anything. 0? Anybody higher? 1. It's in there twice, actually, right before the word et cetera. And so it tells you then when you're doing your site visit that, it might not be as important to the rest of the people as you're saying. And a couple slides I'll show here is actually what I showed a couple days ago, and I expected applause and, nothing. It was really nothing there. But one of the aspects that I wanted to bring up is how you can bring translational work that can be done in under-resourced countries and back here. And so one example is this. Several years ago, about 25 years ago, as we began this HIV program in Kenya, it became clear that these paper records that we had really weren't sufficient because we had to document patients were coming from all over Western Kenya. And so they said, listen, we have to do something. And so they created what they called an open MRS, open medical record system, which basically was allowing people who are being seen to put their information up on the cloud. And this allows us to serve these patients in the AMPATH. And there's about 100,000 patients that were under care at the time. This actually expanded because of its work here. It's now in 50 countries worldwide, and it supports care. It's free, and it's, I think, an example of what can be done. And it's also something that can be done in the United States in the rural parts of the country. We do this point of care system there in which you can, again, with these templates now, see patients in their huts, do HIV testing, and give them an instant result that automatically goes on to the electronic record and gets stored right away. And it's really, now we're expanding that to oncology and the oncology clinics. But it really is an extraordinary thing that actually can be taken back to our place. We created legislation. One of the problems in the low-resource countries is basically care and drugs. And when I first went there about 15 years ago, I was, for all those who've gone over the first time, you remember this. It's like the first time you met your spouse. You just remember it. And I remember there, and I didn't sleep for this week, and I was just torn because of these huge tumors that I saw. There was a pediatrician who was in charge of all cancer with no training. She had a Xerox copy of a chapter from a book from Nairobi. If she saw someone with cancer, she would write some drugs. If it were her template was if it was a solid tumor, that she would give Cytoxan, Adriamycin, and vincristine. And if it was a liquid tumor, she would add prednisone. She would write for these drugs. They would then take it to the village or to the pharmacy and hand it to them, but they didn't have that. They would give them 5-FU or methotrexate or whatever drug was there, and they would get this kind of treatment. The patients often couldn't afford it. It was, a nightmare, if you will. the pathologist, everyone had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, even if they had a big protruding breast mass. I have a picture of a guy with a tumor with his bone, and he came in and he had his x-ray, and you could see a Codman's triangle, and only you knew Codman. He was a surgeon that practiced in the 1800s. But basically seen with osteogenic sarcoma, and indeed we took off his arm and that's what he had. So pathology was inadequate, there's no chemotherapy. And so with this, we were able to actually finally got some money to come in to help pay for generic drugs. But this revolving pharmacy was a mechanism in which those people who had money were able to give it to us. We then used it to leverage to buy other drugs of those who didn't have the resources. And so now everyone that comes into the AMPATH, regardless of their ability to pay, is able to get medicines. And it's worked out terrifically, and it's helped work throughout the system. We've created these CHAMAs, which are these local groups of people, usually women, that get together, about 20 or 30 of them, and they work together to talk to each other about saving money and how they invest it. And it's a beautiful organization because they lend to each other in times of economic needs. It allows them to help pay for health insurance. When we go to these meetings, I love this, and you would probably love this too. If you come into the meeting late, you have to pay a fine. And so they come in late, they have to pay money. And so everyone arrives at right on time, unlike what it is for our fellows, if you will. This is a slide that I used for our site visit, and excuse the hubris of calling AMPATH the model for global oncology, but I wanted to impress our site visitors here. And basically there are three components that I believe are important for an academic model. So the academic model there are three pillars to it. It's the clinical arm, it's the research arm, and the education arm. And the model for AMPATH, the tagline for it is up there on the left, leading with care. And so what we felt that was important, started with the HIV model, if you're gonna go in there, you lead with care. Your job is to go in there and not to get samples that you can take back into the United States and do your analysis, but really to create a system in which people are getting cared for, and then when you leave, you're actually leaving with a difference. And so when we went over there, when they gave chemotherapy, again, it was hung, they had a tent outside, it was hung on a fence. It was just really pretty bad. I saw patients with, I think the majority of the crowd here seems to be radiation oncologists, patients with huge tumors coming off their jaw or in their back, and it just, it affects you in your heart, and you realize that if they were here in the United States, they would get radiation therapy. And so that was one of my missions to get a radiation facility built there. And so with efforts, including efforts from the IU Department of Radiation Oncology, who gave $500,000, which meant, Ralph is back there, so it was $50,000 out of his paycheck because there was only 10 people there. But with that, we were able to leverage with the School of Medicine and with Novartis. And then finally, another donor, we finally built this cancer and chronic care building, which is a picture here. Now, most of the first floor is set up for chemotherapy. We have 4 bunkers for radiation. And that speaker for the IAEA, I want to connect with her because for the last 3 years, even though we've given them money, we haven't got the radiation machines here, but we expect to get it any time. But we went from just a few hundred patients seen to seeing 900 patients a month. We've screened probably close to 70,000 women now for breast and cervical cancer. We now have on ground 10 medical oncologists, radiation, pediatric, and gyne oncologists these are people who have had formal training. I was able, in my position as a division director, to take one of our fellows in a faculty position, and his first role was to go to Kenya, where he spent 2 years there. We had another Med-Peds fellow who was there for 6 months. And then I think the best of the best was Chite Aswara, who was a Kenyan who got training here in the United States, did his medicine residency and fellowship, and he's been on ground there for 5 years. To have a Kenyan as an IU faculty member on ground creates such a sustainable impact. Our chair of Department of Surgery has had a faculty member on ground for the last 4 years in which their department pays for this. University of Toronto has had a person on ground in gyne oncology probably for about 8 years now, but it's the commitment of these institutions to do it. In terms of education, we believe it's critically important that we develop a workforce. This is what we have to do to make this sustainable. And so Chite, well, the first curriculum we developed was by Barry Rosen from University of Toronto. He's now at Beaumont. We created a guiding oncology curriculum. There was some cross-training coming back and forth from Toronto, but what's going on now is that basically these are trained there on ground. This was followed up now by the first in-country medical oncology, nursing oncology, pediatric oncology curriculum, in which the Kenyans themselves go to classes there, they get trained, they have international faculty to help with them. They get a certificate then that makes them special oncologists, but this certificate doesn't mean they can come to the United States and practice. And so we basically don't, if you will, we're disincentivizing people for brain drain. We've had some D43s that have been incredibly helpful. Now, finally, on the research component, which is really what this session was about, I'm a co-PI on a grant in a U54 that looks at HPV in patients, women who have HIV positive and HIV negative. We're doing serial testing for HPV, and I'll give you some examples of this, of some of the outcomes from this. Kara Wool's Calustian is involved with the IEDEA, and this was when we saw patients with Kaposi sarcoma, they just looked at it. So when we first started with this grant, everyone now got biopsied, and this was the first time this ever happened. We've had a number of NCI supplements, including one for a grant writing workshop, and we had one in Burkitt's lymphoma, and we were the first people to join the AMC. This is a picture of Francis Collins and Roger Glass, who came in to visit a couple of years ago. He's talking to Chite Aswara, who's to Francis's immediate right, and Naftali Busakala, who's a Kenyan leader there. When Francis was there, he was so moved by this organization that a quote that he said that the center of medicine in the world is here in Eldoret. I'm not saying that to put hubris on what we're doing, but the fact that we have people working and building healthcare systems in a partnership there is something that he thought was a model for it. A couple of things I'll point out. One of the things with this U54, we will have a symposia that's going to be in Tanzania in another month, so we'll be coming over there. But one of the things that we found, actually, it's interesting to me. I'm not a cervical cancer doctor. I am now because I have this grant. But for HPV causes cervical cancer. You know, if you got rid of HPV with vaccine, you could get rid of a disease, much like polio. It doesn't happen in Kenya. One of the interesting things that we have found is that if we follow HPV, the oncogenic type of HPV in women without HIV, they have an incidence around here. If they have HIV positive, even though they have cervical cancer, they have twice the incidence of oncogenic type HPV. We've also found that the presence of aflatoxin, which is very common in Africa, because they have the corn, they end up having these problems. So we've been actually able to measure aflatoxin titers in these women. And these in women without HIV. In women without HIV, they have twice the incidence of oncogenic HPV viruses. And real quick, one of the problems is access to care. With this supplement, what we found is actually a very simple aspect. If we just help pay for transportation, we actually increased the adherence, and our Burkitt's lymphoma dropout rate fell to 5%, and our survival has gone up to 5%. I'm going to just close with this because this is important to me and an important topic. If you look at a sustainable effect of cancer control, it goes from the pre-morbid condition all the way across into healthcare policy, which goes into the top. There is a way of actually linking all of this, and when you have to have healthcare policy, you have to go back to the pre-morbid condition. This is working with the governments. But as we think about academic institutions and the tripartite mission, again, the linkages are patient care, education, and research. And to your point in terms of what are you going to do, it is important for you to work on patient care. That is the rungs of the ladder that are very important. It's important for you then to be a role model for education so that you can build the next generation of people to do it. And the research is actually the glue that brings in the North Americans here. Without research, there's not going to be a sustainable commitment, because back here, the universities are going to say, what's in it for me? But your responsibility really are the first two pillars. Our responsibility then is to help educate to help develop new researchers and to help with patient care, so that at the end of this, we have something that's incredibly sustainable, something that's going to last beyond the generations that we're here. So I'll stop there. I'm sorry I took over.
I'll ask Dr. Newman to join Dr. Lair and Dr. Davis via teleconference. We're going to take some questions. All right, so while they're getting settled, I will ask, all right, we have a question in the audience already. Good. Yes, why don't we also have Cyprian? Yeah, and Rebecca, please join so that we can have an opportunity to discuss the full breadth of the sessions.
Thank you very much for your panel. It was really very informative. I have two questions that I think relate a bit to sustainability. One question relates to the Global Fund. It's a very good source of funding for AIDS, TB, and malaria, and that's quite vertical, I think, in its approach. What's, just really for any of you, what do you think about the feasibility of making Global Fund more comprehensive so that it can cover oncology treatment, diagnosis, and the other question I have is, it seems like there are a number of you that are involved with programs that are involving multiple institutions, and I wondered if you had experience linking your programs not only with research institutions in the countries where you work, but also other research institutions in other countries. And do you think that those kinds of models of, let's say, a research institution in the United States, a research institution, let's say in Kenya or Tanzania, and maybe one from the Caribbean, would that make for a sustainable model that could perhaps provide also some very interesting complementarity in terms of your research and training? Thank you.
All right.
I'll say one thing. So that our U54 that we're doing is really trying to, we also have a mentoring component to this, and what we're trying to do is to build up the capacity there. So the HPV testing that we're doing is actually done in Kisumu rather than back in the States. We've got biobanking there. With our Burkitt thing, we developed flow cytometry so that we're trying to train the local Kenyans to do it rather than sending samples back to the States. So we're trying to minimize that. In terms of other countries, we work very closely with the University of Toronto. I know that doesn't really count as another country, but it does to our president. And then also Vrije University in Amsterdam has come down for the pediatric component. But I think it becomes a little bit more complex. It is, and I had the same, I was going to ask the question of Cyprian on this, because you've got all these different partners there, and I think sometimes the Kenyan or the African institution develops these individual partnerships with these centers, but the coordination of all these centers isn't exactly there. That they're, it's it's like a husband with 7 wives. The husband gets maybe the benefit, but the 7 wives don't get together to really work together and how they can really nail the husband and really hold him accountable to do the housework and stuff. So I don't know. It's a bad analogy, but I'm just. Help me. Start talking. Yeah, happy Valentine's Day, yeah. Think of all the candy that has to go out. So you mentioned 6 different institutions that are working in Bacaro. So are all of them working together arm in arm, or are they separate relationships?
That's a good question. Actually, I would say that all our partners are coordinated through partners in health. So they are coordinated through PIH, and we actually try to coordinate even their schedule and their expertise. For example, if we know that at Brown we have Scott, and then if if another university comes in, then partners in health will be able to say that if you can bring an expert nurse, it will be better than if you bring another radiation oncologist, because they will think Scott is there. So I would say that that type of coordination has been very useful in terms of making sure that we are not duplicating efforts on similar needs. I don't know if I answered your question, or if Becky can add on.
Well, I was thinking, so I spent time at Butaro between my residency and oncology fellowship. And since I've been in fellowship, I've also been involved in a collaboration between UCSF and Ocean Road Cancer Institute in Tanzania. And it's been interesting thinking a little bit about exchange from the ground up instead of more of a top-down model. In fact, and there are a few colleagues here in the room who have trained at Ocean Road. I think there are a lot of opportunities for exchange. You know, several of the initiatives that we've been involved in at Butaro to build an oncology care delivery system that involves, you know, sort of mundane things like clinical forms and clinical protocols and other system type of things. We're now talking about implementing those kinds of systems at Ocean Road to improve the clinical care. And there's a lot of crosstalk about when it comes to things like you know, FNA training or biopsy training, nursing capacity building, protocol development. And so there's been sort of an organic exchange, but it would be, I think there's a lot of opportunity to formalize those kinds of collaborations. And you know, I know of some examples of you know, growing research collaborations among institutions in East Africa, for example. But it does seem like there's an opportunity to sort of, be more efficient as far as collaborations in the region instead of many separate collaborations with US institutions.
And I think we have time for one more question. Dr. Manakriza?
Thank you. My question is directed to Dr. Newman. We have a similar initiative in prostate cancer. It's called the MADCAP network. You know, similar to your work in breast cancer. My question is more related to how do you go away from the vulture versus prey mentality of coming over, getting data and go away, you know, in terms of sustainability of data generation on a local basis, given that, you know, many of the institutions back in Africa do not have the capacity you have in genetic analysis. So how do you build that more now to have the data coming in on a more regular basis from the local partners?
You raise a very, very good point, and it is extremely difficult to make sure that these international partnerships continue to grow, to mature, and very importantly, as we've all been echoing here, that they hold of paramount importance, capacity building in the African institutions. So on the breast cancer side, I've just been extremely fortunate with the partners that I've been blessed to work with. And over the years, when our group has relocated between institutions, we've maintained close ties with the prior institution where we worked, so that those institutions continue to invest in the international efforts. And internationally, as we've expanded and worked with other sites, those relationships have been very durable because they've become like family. We've all seen each other's kids grow up. We're just, very, very close over time. So that trust really evolved very naturally. Our annual conferences serve as a nice opportunity for everybody in our partnership to be together physically. And we also follow a train-the-trainer type of a model, so that some of the partners that we've worked with for longer times in Africa, such as the Kamfanochi Teaching Hospital, they have now taken on the challenge of training the other sites in Africa with immunohistochemistry, core biopsy.
All right, and to wrap up the session, I'll turn to Dr. Davis. Anything to add to that? Any final comments?
I'll just say that as I was trying to allude to, a lot of the emerging technologies that we have here in the United States, I think it's very important, as the last question was sort of getting at, that we put some of the equipment on the ground and that we train our collaborators to be able to do a lot of this genomics analyses. One of the things that we do here for precision medicine, for instance, is match patients to drugs. And so as we sort of achieve our endeavors of getting access to our African nations, getting access to these drugs, is going to be increasingly important that we ensure that they are matched to the right molecular targets. And so it will become very important that on the ground that the oncologists, the pathologists, and the, quote, geneticists are able to run these tests. So I think that's our next goal moving forward.
Fantastic. I want to thank all of the panelists, and I apologize we didn't get to the Global Fund question, but during the break, which will end at 3:10, you can feel free to discuss it.